You already know exactly how this cycle feels. The month begins with a quiet, internal promise. This time you tell yourself, it will be different. This time, you will hold on to your resources. You will save the capital. You will protect your time. You will stop bleeding out your leverage on things that do not matter. You map it out in your head. The logic is perfect. And then, the third week arrives. You look at your accounts. You look at your energy levels. You look at your schedule. And the reserve is gone, not because of a catastrophe, not because of a massive, dramatic failure in judgment. It is just gone. A little compromise here, a minor justification there. Suddenly, your baseline looks exactly like it did last month, and exactly like it did the month before that. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a very specific, very toxic narrative begins to play. You start to believe the lie that accumulation, whether it is wealth, power, or optionality, is something reserved for a different kind of man. You tell yourself that they must possess a genetic trait you are missing, that they have unbreakable willpower, that they are simply superior in their daily discipline. You internalize the failure as a character flaw. You think you are weak. You aren't. By the end of this, you are going to recognize a pattern you have likely been participating in for years without having the words for it. You will understand that you have been playing a rigged biological game, and you will learn the exact architecture required to make the accumulation of leverage inevitable. But first, we have to dismantle the most dangerous piece of modern mythology you have ever been sold: the delusion of willpower. We are taught to treat willpower as a moral virtue. If you are a good man, a strong man, you will simply resist temptation. You will stand firm against the current. But willpower is not a virtue. It is a biological resource. It is a battery. It is fully charged at 8 in the morning, immediately after a black coffee, when the day is young and your stress is low. It is completely empty by 9 at night, after a day of managing other people's incompetence, absorbing professional friction, and navigating a world designed to agitate you. Why do you keep building your entire strategy for the future on a foundation you already know will collapse by Thursday evening? You are trying to white-knuckle your way through an environment that is actively hostile to your success. You exist in a society where billions of dollars are spent engineering algorithms, frictionless payment systems, and synthetic urgencies, all perfectly calibrated to extract your attention and your capital the exact moment your psychological defenses are lowered. If your capacity to build a reserve depends on you feeling motivated, disciplined, and stoic every single day for the next 6 months, you have already lost. Not because you lack character, because you built your strategy on the wrong foundation. You are relying on virtue. Niccolò Machiavelli spent his life dissecting the anatomy of power, not the loud, performative power of shouting and chest beating, the quiet, structural power that survives contact with human weakness. He observed a fatal flaw in how men operate. When they want to secure their positions, they demand consistency from human nature. They expect people to be good. They expect themselves to be disciplined. Machiavelli understood that consistency is a myth. His entire philosophy of power rests on an idea that most men never think to apply to their own behavior. Never rely on virtue when you can rely on structure. He did not trust human beings to consistently make the difficult choice over the easy one. He didn't trust leaders to remain selfless. And if he were analyzing your life today, he would not trust the version of you that is exhausted, stressed, and looking for a quick dopamine hit at the end of a long week. He trusted systems to make human weakness irrelevant. That is not cynicism, that is precision. The men who possess real leverage, the ones who accumulate wealth and optionality so rapidly it almost looks unfair, do not negotiate with their desires every morning. They do not wake up and ask themselves if they feel like being disciplined today. They made the decision once. Then they built a mechanism that executes that decision automatically. regardless of how they feel. They don't expect themselves to be heroes, they operate as architects. An architect does not hold the roof up with his bare hands. He designs a framework where gravity does the work for him. If you want to stop running in place, you have to accept an uncomfortable truth about yourself. You cannot trust your future self to make the right decision. Your future self will be tired. Your future self will feel entitled to a reward. Your future self will find a brilliant, perfectly logical justification to break your own rules. You must stop managing your behavior and start managing your environment. You have to trap yourself in a system where winning is the default state and failing requires active, strenuous effort. This is the shift from playing defense to playing strategy. But to build this architecture, you first have to understand a fundamental error in how your brain processes the resources you already have. You have to realize why looking at your own reserves is the exact behavior that guarantees you will destroy them. It has to do with an evolutionary glitch in how we perceive proximity, and until you correct it, every dollar and every hour you save will quietly find a way to disappear. Consider the exact moment you open your accounts to check your balances. You see the number sitting there. It is a good month, the reserve is healthy. You feel a momentary sense of security, a quiet validation that your hard work is finally translating into tangible leverage. But notice carefully what happens in the background of your mind over the next 72 hours. The threshold for what you consider a necessary expenditure begins to subtly, almost imperceptibly shift. That piece of software you were planning to hold off on, suddenly it looks like an essential investment in your productivity. That expensive dinner you usually wouldn't justify. You had a punishing week at the office. You navigated a difficult negotiation. You have been disciplined lately. You earned it. You did not consciously decide to drain your capital. Your brain simply noticed proximity to a resource, and it immediately constructed a perfectly logical narrative to justify its consumption. Men are particularly vulnerable to a very specific variation of this rationalization. We rarely blow our reserves on obvious frivolities when we are trying to be careful. We do not want to feel irresponsible, so we mask our consumption as preparation. We buy a slightly better tool. We upgrade a piece of technology. We pay for a service that promises to optimize our time. We convince ourselves that these are not expenses, but strategic investments that will somehow increase our future output. It is a highly sophisticated lie. You are actively diluting your leverage, but you are doing it in a way that allows you to maintain the identity of a disciplined strategist. To understand why you do this, you have to understand a fundamental evolutionary glitch in your own psychology. You are carrying a primal brain into a digitized, hyper-capitalist arena. Evolutionarily speaking, the human mind was not designed to comprehend the abstract concept of financial reserves sitting undisturbed in a digital ledger. In the ancestral environment, hoarding perishable resources did not make sense. If you found a surplus of calories, you did not save them for next winter. You consumed them immediately before they spoiled or before a rival took them from you. War to your subconscious wiring. Available simply means meant to be consumed. It does not matter what your conscious, rational mind intended to do with that surplus. If the resource is visible and if it is easily accessible, a deep, ancient part of your psychology will relentlessly hunt for a reason to deploy it. This is the fatal flaw in how the vast majority of men attempt to build a position of power. They employ the strategy of the leftover. They wait for their income to arrive. They pay their mandatory obligations. They navigate the month, trying to exercise restraint, and they silently promise themselves they will save whatever remains at the end of the cycle. But there is rarely anything left over. Not because they suffered a crisis, because human desire operates like a gas in a vacuum. It automatically expands to fill the volume of the container it is placed in. Parkinson's law dictates that work expands to fill the time allotted for its completion. The financial and energetic equivalent is equally absolute. Your consumption will always expand to absorb the visible resources available in your immediate environment. That is not a flaw in your character. That is exactly how a human brain is supposed to handle proximity to abundance. If you truly understand this mechanism, you stop trying to fight your own biology. You do not ask a starving man to carry fresh meat in his pocket and simply trust him to choose not to eat it. You remove the temptation from his environment entirely. If you want to accumulate resources with the speed and ruthless efficiency of the men who actually hold power, you must adopt what we can call the Disappearance Protocol. You must become Machiavellian toward your own impulses. The moment the resource enters your ecosystem, before the rent is paid, before the groceries are bought, and most importantly, before your conscious mind can assign a narrative of ownership to it, a fixed percentage must vanish. It leaves your primary ecosystem immediately. It lands somewhere your daily brain does not register as belonging to you. A separate institution, a ledger you do not look at. An account with no frictionless access, no debit card, and no application sitting on the home screen of your phone. You do this not because you are paranoid about the banking system. You do this because you refuse to trust the version of yourself that is exhausted at 11 at night, staring at a screen exactly 2 clicks away from a checkout page. This single aggressive maneuver achieves something profound. It does not merely protect the capital. It forcibly resets your psychological baseline. If 20% of your leverage disappears before you ever process its arrival, your brain cannot budget around the full amount. It is forced to recalibrate. Within a matter of weeks, a strange adaptation occurs. You genuinely forget that the missing piece was ever yours to spend. You have artificially enforced scarcity on your present self in order to guarantee absolute leverage for your future self. The men who build impenetrable positions of power do not save what is left after spending. They spend what is left after saving. The mathematical equation is exactly the same. The psychological outcome is radically different. One relies on constant, exhausting daily discipline. The other relies on an invisible architecture that never gets tired, never rationalizes, and never asks for a reward. But even if you build this architecture, even if you successfully vanish the large sums before your brain can claim them, you are likely still bleeding out. Because the most dangerous threats to your stability are rarely the large visible decisions. The real theft is happening quietly. It is happening in the microtransactions of your daily life. And worse, you are not losing these resources because you are careless. You are losing them because you are paying a very specific, invisible tax just to maintain the illusion of who you think you are. If you look closely at how power has been dismantled throughout history, you will notice a consistent theme. Great fortresses rarely fall to direct catastrophic assaults. They do not collapse because a battering ram breaks the main gate. They collapse because of a slow, unnoticed rot in the foundation, a rusted hinge, a compromised guard, a subtle poisoning of the water supply. Your personal leverage drains in exactly the same way. Most men never go bankrupt, emotionally or financially, from one massive miscalculation. They bleed out through hundreds of invisible, seemingly insignificant choices that never felt like decisions at all. $5 here, $15 there, a minor convenience fee, a recurring charge you barely notice individually. None of these microtransactions register as a threat, and that is precisely what makes them so lethal. They bypass your psychological defense mechanisms because they are dressed as trivialities. But if you strip away the rationalizations and look at what is actually happening, you will discover an uncomfortable truth about where your resources are going. You are not paying for utility, you are paying an identity tax. A significant percentage of the capital, and attention you expend every month is strictly dedicated to maintaining a fictional version of yourself. Think about the subscriptions currently running on autopilot in the background of your life. The premium news publication you haven't read in 6 weeks. The high-level fitness application you opened twice in January. The masterclass on a skill you have no real intention of mastering. Why do you keep paying for them? You do not keep them because they are useful. You keep them because canceling them feels like an admission of defeat. As long as that monthly charge hits your account, you get to tell yourself a story. You get to maintain the illusion that you are the kind of man who stays informed on global markets. You are the kind of man who optimizes his physical performance. You are the kind of man who is constantly learning. You are outsourcing your sense of identity to a $12 recurring fee. And the corporations that design these systems know it. They are not selling you a service. They are selling you psychological absolution. They know that as long as the cost remains low enough to avoid triggering your survival instincts, you will continue to fund their empires indefinitely, just to avoid facing the reality of your own inaction. Then there is the trap of convenience, the food delivery apps, the premium ride services, the endless outsourcing of minor friction. When challenged on this, men almost always use the same defensive script. My time is valuable. You convince yourself that you are operating like a high-level executive, delegating the mundane tasks of life so you can focus on higher pursuits. But if you are entirely honest with yourself, you are not using that saved hour to build an empire. You are using it to scroll through a screen, numb your nervous system, and recover from a job you tolerate. You are not buying time. You are purchasing the appearance of status. Machiavelli had zero patience for the illusion of comfort. He understood that comfort, when it is not backed by actual, unshakable power, is just a velvet leash. The elite architecture of modern commerce is designed to keep you feeling perfectly comfortable, perfectly satiated, and entirely dependent. They manufacture your desires, provide you with the exact tools to satisfy them, and quietly extract your labor in the process. They allow you to feel like a king in your living room, ordering meals from a glass rectangle, while they accumulate the actual leverage that runs the world. Stop existing as a spectator in someone else's empire. If you want to reclaim your power, you must perform an act of ruthless self-auditing, and you must do it manually. Do not use a brightly colored financial application that categorizes your spending into neat, abstract little charts. Those applications are designed to soften the blow. They turn your life into a game. Power does not operate in abstractions. Power requires the raw, unvarnished truth. Pull up your actual ledger from the last 60 days, every single line item. You are going to look for the places where your resources leave your control without a fight. You are not doing this to judge yourself. Guilt is a useless emotion. Guilt is what weak men use to simulate accountability without actually changing their behavior. You are looking at this data with the cold, detached eye of a military strategist, auditing a compromised perimeter. You are gathering intelligence on your own psychological vulnerabilities. Notice the patterns. What is the specific trigger that causes you to authorize a transaction without thinking? Is it stress? Is it the desire to impress a specific demographic? Is it the need to soothe yourself after a confrontation at work? Find the single category where your leverage leaks the fastest. With the least amount of resistance, you will recognize it immediately, because it is the exact category you already feel slightly defensive about. It is the one where you instantly start formulating excuses in your head before anyone has even asked you to explain it. That defensiveness is the signal. Men do not get defensive about things that do not matter. Once you isolate that specific leak, you do not attempt to eliminate it entirely. Absolute deprivation is a fragile strategy. It relies on the very willpower we have already proven is destined to fail. Instead, you cut it precisely in half. You force friction back into the system. You convert a mindless default back into a conscious decision. A default cannot be negotiated with. It simply happens to you. A decision requires your active participation. When you cancel the subscriptions that flatter your ego, and when you halve the spending that soothes your anxiety, you redirect that freed capital straight into the hidden architecture we built in the previous step. Suddenly, the math fundamentally changes. You are no longer relying on a massive increase in your income to change your position in the world. You have simply stopped funding your own psychological distractions. The reserve begins to grow. The leverage starts to accumulate faster than you thought possible. But this is exactly where the architecture becomes perilous. Because the moment that hidden account crosses a certain threshold, the moment the numbers start to look like actual tangible power, a new psychological phenomenon occurs. It is a mechanism so deceptive that it regularly destroys men who have spent months executing their strategy flawlessly, and it is driven by an emotion you have been taught to trust your entire life. The emotion is confidence. You have been conditioned to believe that confidence is the ultimate objective. You have been told that if you simply cultivate enough belief in yourself, your success is guaranteed. But in the mechanics of accumulation, confidence arriving at the exact wrong moment is infinitely more dangerous than any mistake you have ever made. Let's examine the specific psychological choke point where most men accidentally burn their own empires to the ground before the foundation is even dry. It does not happen when they are broke. When you are operating at zero, you are sharp. Scarcity forces focus. You watch every movement. Your survival instincts are fully engaged because they have to be. You cannot afford the luxury of a mistake. But then, the architecture we just built starts working. You audit the invisible leaks. You sever the identity taxes. You redirect the capital. The hidden reserve begins to accumulate. You cross a threshold. Maybe it is 3,000. Maybe it is 10,000. It doesn't matter what the specific number is, only that it registers in your brain as a tangible buffer against reality. For the first time in months, you feel a genuine release of tension in your chest. The wolf is no longer at the door. You can breathe. And right there, in that split second of relief, a very quiet, very lethal psychological shift takes place. You open the ledger, you see the leverage sitting there, and a voice whispers, "I have been disciplined. I have proven my capability. I have earned a slight reprieve." That thought on its own seems perfectly reasonable, but it is the psychological equivalent of a virus bypassing a firewall. Because you do not just take one reward, you break the seal. And the moment the seal is broken, the reserve loses its psychological authority. It degrades from a sacred instrument of power into just another checking account. One minor withdrawal becomes two. Two becomes a promise that you will replace the capital next month, and next month, predictably, never arrives. The first few units of power are the hardest to build, but they are infinitely the easiest to destroy. Because the moment you view that reserve, your brain stops treating it as an untouchable monolith of leverage and begins treating it as available utility. You treat early growth as permission to compromise. This is not merely a financial error. This is a profound Jungian act of self-sabotage. The truth is, many men do not actually know how to exist as someone who holds power. They have spent their entire adult lives identifying as the underdog. The man who is struggling, the man who is grinding, the man who is perpetually overcoming a deficit. Scarcity is uncomfortable, but it is deeply familiar. It tells you exactly who you are. Holding leverage, actual, undisturbed power, is unfamiliar territory. It requires a radically different identity. It requires you to be a man who possesses resources without being controlled by the neurosis of needing to immediately discharge them to soothe his own anxiety. Subconsciously, you feel the tension of this new identity. It feels wrong, so you create a brilliant rationalization to drain the reserve, returning yourself to zero. returning yourself to the familiar state of the hustle. This is exactly why you see men hit the same financial milestone 3 separate times in their lives, only to mysteriously wipe it out and start over, constantly bewildered by their own bad luck. It is not bad luck. It is the shadow self rejecting an identity it is not yet mature enough to hold. Machiavelli warned that a prince who feels entirely secure is a prince who is about to be deposed. Security breeds complacency. Complacency breeds fatal errors. When you feel entirely secure looking at a small reserve, you lose your edge. You start treating that reserve not as a weapon you are forging, but as a trophy you are admiring. To survive this phase, you must adopt a principle of absolute emotional detachment from your own progress. Growth is not a reward you have unlocked. Growth is simply mathematical proof that the architecture is functioning exactly as designed. The only correct response to proof is to let the machine keep running untouched. Nobody who ever built a formidable position of power did so by throwing a celebration and extracting resources every time they passed a minor milestone. They treated the milestone as cold data. To enforce this detachment, you must introduce the concept of strategic friction. We established earlier that the account must be separate. But as the number grows, separation is no longer enough. It must become actively, aggressively inconvenient. If you can access your accumulated leverage in under 60 seconds from the glass rectangle sitting in your pocket, it is not secure. It is fatally vulnerable to your weakest moment on your worst day. You must construct a physical wall between your accumulated power and your impulsive nature. This might mean placing the reserve in an institution that requires a physical phone call to authorize a transfer. It might mean routing it through a vehicle that imposes a strict 3-day delay on liquidity. You are intentionally degrading the convenience of your own life in order to upgrade your security. Emotions have a half-life. A biological impulse to spend, to flex, or to soothe yourself rarely survives 72-hour forced waiting. If moving the money out requires days of delay and 3 annoying administrative steps, the impulse will almost always die of starvation before it can be executed. Not because you suddenly summoned heroic willpower, because you intelligently removed the opportunity to be weak. You locked the gate and you threw away the key, knowing full well that you yourself are the primary threat to the fortress. But defense alone will only take you so far. You can audit your invisible leaks. You can cut the subscriptions that flatter your ego. You can lock away the capital behind layers of deliberate friction. Eventually, however, you will hit a mathematical ceiling. You can only trim so much fat before you are cutting into the bone. And that is exactly where the vast majority of men stall out. They sit there, perfectly defensive, perfectly frugal, waiting for permission from the world to advance. They wait for a promotion that may never come. They wait for the market to shift. They wait for an external authority to magically grant them more resources. To break through that ceiling, you must fundamentally change the physics of how your resources behave. You must transition from pure defense into the automation of offense. You have to build a secondary engine, one that operates entirely in the background, quietly accelerating your timeline without requiring your physical presence or your daily labor. Because when the defensive architecture we just built collides with automated offense, something terrifying happens to the mathematics of your life. We are fundamentally obsessed with the mythology of the grinder. If you look at modern culture, especially the spaces dedicated to self-improvement and ambition, you will find a strange, pervasive worship of suffering. We idolize the man who wakes up at 4 in the morning, stares into the mirror, and conquers his own biology through sheer, brutal force of will. We are told that if we simply suffer enough, if we white-knuckle our way through the resistance every single day, we will eventually secure our position. We believe that if it doesn't hurt, we haven't earned it. It is a highly romanticized image. And it is a devastatingly inefficient way to live. The most formidable men in the world, the ones who wield actual terrifying leverage, do not spend their mornings negotiating with their own desires. They do not exhaust their cognitive bandwidth trying to convince themselves to do the right thing. They understand a fundamental rule of strategy. A man who has to fight his own mind every day is a man who is eventually going to lose. So they remove the fight. They automate their ruthlessness. Once you have vanished the capital, audited the identity tax, and built a fortress of strategic friction, the final step is to remove yourself from the equation entirely. You must take every defensive and offensive move we have discussed and place them on a mechanized, irreversible timeline, the transfer that happens the moment your primary resource arrives. It must execute without your permission. The redirected capital from the cancelled subscriptions, it routes automatically into the hidden reserve. The payment that destroys your high-interest debt. The debt that is currently funding someone else's empire with your labor. It leaves your account before you have the chance to wonder if you can afford it this month. You do not review these actions. You do not authorize them. You do not check in to see how motivated you are feeling today. They happen with the cold, indifferent consistency of gravity. This is exactly where you separate yourself from 99% of the population. Most men are terrified of this level of automation. They want to feel like they are in control of their lives, which means they insist on making a manual decision every time a resource moves. They want to hold the steering wheel tightly in their hands. But by holding the wheel, they ensure their progress is perpetually anchored to their emotional state. If they have a bad week, the progress stops. If they feel unappreciated at work, they sabotage the machinery. If they feel a brief surge of unearned confidence, they dismantle the reserve. You must surrender the illusion of daily control in order to guarantee absolute long-term authority. When a system runs without your permission, it no longer cares about your bad days. It survives your moments of weakness. It survives your rationalizations. And this brings us to the necessary collision of defense and offense. You cannot simply shrink your way to massive leverage. Absolute deprivation has a ceiling. At some point, extreme defense must convert into automated offense. You have to build a secondary engine. This is the quiet stream of leverage. Whether it is a digital asset, a leveraged skill, or an asynchronous service that operates entirely in the background. It does not need to be a massive, revolutionary enterprise that requires you to quit your job. It just needs to be a mechanism that acquires resources while your physical body is doing something else. Machiavelli understood that true power is not built in explosive, theatrical bursts of effort. Those are for show. True power is built through quiet, relentless, unremarkable consistency. When an automated defensive architecture meets a quietly compounding offensive engine, the mathematics of your life become terrifying to the people around you. What society told you would take a decade suddenly takes 14 months. Not because you are working 10 times harder than the man next to you, but because you stopped bleeding out, and you stopped relying on your own fluctuating discipline to keep the machine moving forward. This is the master insight. This is the realization that permanently shifts your identity. You are no longer playing the role of the stoic warrior, bravely fighting off temptation at the gates of your own mind. You are the architect. The warrior is constantly exhausted. The warrior is always one bad day away from a fatal error. The architect sleeps peacefully, knowing the walls he designed are doing the heavy lifting for him. He has accepted his human nature. He knows he is fully capable of weakness, of laziness, of irrational self-sabotage. He does not pretend to be a god. He simply built a system that makes his human flaws completely irrelevant. When you stop trusting your virtue and start trusting your structure, the underlying anxiety of your life disappears. You stop treating the accumulation of leverage as an act of brutal suffering. and you begin treating it as the natural, inevitable byproduct of a life that is actually being run on purpose. Before you close this out, I want you to sit in the discomfort for just a moment. Do not deflect this. Ask yourself the questions you have been actively avoiding. What pattern of self-sabotage have you normalized as just the way you are? Where are you bleeding out your power simply to avoid a difficult conversation with yourself? What fictional identity are you paying a monthly tax to maintain? And what would happen, starting today, if you simply removed your own option to be weak? Do not answer these quickly. Let the weight of them sit. The men who consume psychological breakdowns like this usually split into two very distinct categories. The first group feels a temporary synthetic surge of dopamine. They feel understood. They feel momentarily intelligent. They nod their heads at the screen, and then they go right back to their default behaviors, perpetually wondering why their reality never matches their potential. The second group recognizes the exact moment a door has opened. They do not try to fix their entire lives in one afternoon. They simply pick one structural change, one identity tax to cancel, one automated transfer to set up, one piece of friction to install between themselves and their capital, and they execute it before the feeling fades. If you are ready to claim this shift, go into the comments right now and write this exact phrase: I trust the architecture. Writing it publicly is not about performative engagement. It is about drawing a psychological line in the sand for your own subconscious. It is planting the flag of a new structural identity, if this is the kind of psychological clarity you are looking for. If you want to understand the hidden mechanisms governing human behavior, status, and the architecture of power, this is exactly what Velvet Dagger is built for. Subscribe to the channel. We are dissecting the real rules of the game, not the comforting lies you were taught to keep you obedient. In the next video, we are going to explore a much darker consequence of this transformation. We will examine the psychology of the people around you when they realize you are no longer playing by their rules. We will uncover exactly why your sudden growth triggers their deepest insecurities and how to navigate the quiet sabotage they will inevitably direct at you. Until then, stay analytical and build the machine.